Support for Veterans Corner Radio is made possible by M&M Printing and the Observer News of Ruskin, Florida.
Hello and welcome to Veterans Corner Radio Podcast, information for and about veterans. For part 2 of this two-part podcast, Joe welcomes back retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Adelbert Buz Carpenter. In this episode, we continue with part 2 of our show featuring SR-71 Blackbird pilot, retired United States Air Force Colonel Buz Carpenter. Today, Buz will take us to new heights as he continues telling us about his career and his life now as a retired aviator volunteering at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Here now is Joe Mulberger with Veterans Corner Radio on Veterans Corner Radio Podcasts.
Welcome to Veterans Corner Radio, a show dedicated to providing information to all those who have served our country's military and to their families. Now, here is your host, combat veteran and educator, retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Joe Mulberger.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to today's show. This is a two-part show. We are speaking with retired United States Air Force Colonel Adelbert Buz Carpenter. He's a 1967 Air Force Academy graduate with a wonderful background. If you grow up and your dad is doing the research of aircraft that are taken from the enemy so that we can figure out how their aircraft work from World War II and then some, that's the environment you grew up with. And we had left off in the last show with how you refuel the SR-71. You had some absolutely amazing times as an SR-71 pilot. So tell us this, what was the fastest you ever went?
One time I got into our nominal top speed was 3.2 Mach, which is about 2,150 miles an hour. If we felt threatened, we were fully authorized to go to 3.3. Like when we set the speed record from Los Angeles to Dulles Airport, LAX to Dulles Airport, they were cruising at 3.28 Mach. And the speed record, the absolute speed record, which is still the record for the world, 2,193 miles an hour set for our bicentennial, is again 3.28. The fastest I was ever at was 3.35, because when the airplane loved, as it went faster, it loved to go faster. And so if you came out of afterburner, you really risked causing a compressor stall. So what you did, you forced the airplane into a climb. As it went into the climb, it was no longer able to accelerate. You would bring it to the speed you wanted it at and then settle it there. So I would say most of the guys probably, I know there were a couple cases that might have gotten to 3.4, but there's a question of how accurate our gauges were there. And I know Lou Shop, when he was doing the test work on the A-12, they actually took the A-12 to 3.5. The airplane was very unstable. So that's when they decided 3.2 would be the top normal speed for the airplane. That's when the inlet was in its full aft position, and that was as far back as it could go to adjust the airflow coming into the engine.
Now, when you're going that fast, we've seen what's depicted in movies and things like that. Is there a shuttering of that specific aircraft, the SR-71, as you're traversing from one speed to another speed?
When you go through, you've seen the movie of whoever breaking Mach 1 and the airplane shuttering. In the SR-71, it was so powerful. What you typically did, you climbed up to 33,000 feet, you pushed the nose over, you went into full afterburner, because that area from about Mach 1 to 1.1 to 1.15 is a high drag area. So what you did by going to 33,000, you slide, we call the dipsy, a slight descent. You went through that area very quickly, and then you bring the nose up and continue your climb. There's also another reason. They wanted us to stay above 30,000 feet because of the shock wave, because now you're setting up the boom, and the boom could be destructive. A matter of fact, most people would be surprised. Sometimes we were directed to fly over heads of state when they were greeting each other and purposely boomed them to send them a message they were doing things counter to U.S. policy. I know of a flight before my time that when Brezhnev was meeting Castro in Havana, there was an SR-71 that flew over and boomed them. Also, SR-71s flew over Noriega's house in Panama the 3 days before he finally left Panama, that the U.S. government was trying to get him, because on the fourth day, the Marines were going to land. So the shock wave could be damaging. We broke windows at times. We had no control over exactly where the shock went and how intense it might be.
There were regular sorties over Cuba. Can you tell us a little bit about how frequent those were, and then sort of bring us to a close on when those stopped? And you weren't at altitude doing those, were you? You were at a much lower altitude, so there was a visual on the ground of, here comes that SR-71 from the United States, wasn't there?
Well, see, that's part of the myth. We used to overfly Cuba every 45 days to keep track of the Russians and the Cubans. And typically you would take off from California, you go straight to altitude. Over Texas, you'd refuel, entered over the Gulf of Mexico, you would start your climb, and you had to be above 75,000 feet and 3.15 Mach before you could cross into Cuba, and your defensive systems had to work. So our pictures were all taken from altitude. We didn't take pictures of low altitude. And so you're going to feel the shock wave, but you're not going to see the aircraft per se unless you had special binoculars or a telescope. One of the most interesting sorties, as President Ford was about to turn over the presidency to President Carter, he knew President Carter felt that overflying other countries was immoral if you didn't have their permission. So one of the last directions from President Ford was, I want a Cuban overflight. Now listen to the date, on the 20th of January, 1977. And the airplane has to be back on the ground at Beale Air Force Base not later than 10 minutes before President Carter takes the oath of office. So I was in the wing commander's office when the wing commander called back to Washington and said, mission success, aircraft on the ground. And 10 minutes later, President Carter took the oath of office. We went for almost a year and a half maybe, no overflight, because he thought it was immoral. And then he realized that there was so much valuable information on what the Russians were doing that we had to go back to overflights. Now, we never overflew Russia or Red China. That's based on the agreement between President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev back with the U-2 shoot-down. And as far as I know, that's still the policy today. Any information collected there is collected from satellites.
Absolutely amazing. So you flew out, you were one of only 2 SR-71 pilots that flew out of Diego Garcia. Is that right?
That's correct.
And when was that, and what was that in support of?
That was actually a test mission. We actually flew along the Vietnam's coast, and we'd set that up. I was part of the group that actually helped built the location there. And I think originally it was the idea that we would fly into the Middle East to possibly keep track of Iran and other bad actors and not come out of Europe, come from a different direction. One of the interesting things that came about for Diego Garcia, it's south of the equator. We had an astro tracking navigation system. We affectionately called it R2D2, and it would take them an hour 45 to line it up in the hangar, tell the computer exactly where it was on the face of the earth, put our whole mission in there, and we could start the engines, pull out of the hangar, and if it was a clear day or clear night, within 2 minutes, it locked on the stars. We guaranteed the president 300 feet anywhere in the world, traveling at 2,200 miles an hour. And how we track these stars, I still don't completely understand, but we had a North Star catalog, because almost all the missions flown by the SR-71 were north of the equator. and we also had a southern star catalog. Well, the particular mission that I flew into Diego Garcia, the technicians forgot that it was south of the equator. So as we were approaching the equator, coming across the Indian Ocean, all of a sudden we're not tracking stars anymore. And so my RSO and I have a short discussion, and I said, we're just going to dead reckon it. We know where Diego Garcia is effectively, and I'm sure we can pick up the TACAD. Well, we were about 800 miles away, but we in fact found the island, landed there. A couple days later, because they didn't bring the Southern Star catalog with them, the idea was you take off from Diego Garcia, climb up to altitude, and then take up a northeast heading, and we think by the time you approach the equator, your system will see the stars again, and it will successfully navigate you back to Japan. And it in fact did exactly that.
That would have been a hairy moment to go, hey, Nav, I hope you brought the Rand McNally map, because we did find Diego Garcia somewhere around here.
It's a horseshoe-shaped island, one of those like jokes that comedians used to have about airline pilots. Oh, did anybody know what Hawaii looks like?
What time frame was it that you were flying out of Diego Garcia for those test flights?
That would have been, we set up the detachment, I want to say, I think in 1979, as I recall. There was one pilot ahead of me, I think, flew in there in 1980. I flew in January of 81, as I recall.
Not much to see or do on Diego Garcia, if I understand that right.
No, it's not. It's a military location. It's a British protectorate in a very strategic location, and has been used extensively during Desert Storm and today for other operations.
So in the late 90s, the SR-71 was taken out of mothball, sent to France, and as I understand it, there was a desire to try and do research and development on scramjet engines or hypersonic type, and I may be stepping out of the lines of what type of engines were being tested, but it was understood that on the backs of SR-71s, they were mounting these various engine types to test their capabilities. Do you have some insight into those and whatever happened with those tests? And did we actually turn it into something?
Those tests actually took place, but not in France. They took place at Edwards Air Force Base at the NASA, because up until the last SR flights, quote, were in 1999, and they were test flights because NASA needed a Mach 3 test bed to run different experiments off of. And there was a spike on the back of an SR-71 that was working towards a scramjet type of operation. I have little or no knowledge exactly how far they took it from there. I mean, obviously now we're testing hypersonic vehicles off the West Coast. So part of the basis of the engines in those vehicles may have in fact come from those late 90s tests on the back of the SR-71.
Yeah, and the proposal was that those engine types would go into a replacement for the space shuttle and that type of stuff. And there was a variety of configured designs that were brought up for that.
Well, the problem is today, it's the same thing, is that to get a scramjet started, you have to get it typically above Mach 3. So how do you successfully get an engine up to Mach 3? And then if you want to recover it, when you come back down through Mach 3, like in our case, we transitioned back. The engine that then below Mach 2 was like a turbojet. It was when it was above Mach 2 that it became a turbo ram, bypass engine that gave us that ram effect that was so effective. And it turns out when you incorporated the ram effect, you actually got about 50% more thrust and you burned 20% less fuel. So the SR-71 was the only airplane that the faster we went, the less fuel we burned. So if you, for some reason, were low on your fuel because the air temperature was too high or some other cause, you could accelerate as long as you could make the turns. Like in the Baltic, we couldn't go above 2.8 Mach because we couldn't stay outside the territorial limits of those different countries. Now, we used to turn left as we passed Estonia, and I have to say the neutral Swedes were very tolerant because we actually flew in part of their territorial airspace inside of Gotland Island, but they never said a word about it.
You did some pretty amazing flights. Like, comparatively, the Concorde was known for flying from either Paris or London to New York, and it would be a 3-hour flight. You did one of those amazing flights where you flew from somewhere in the United States to the British Islands, and it was an amazing feat because of how fast it took for you to get there. Can you explain a little bit about that flight in particular?
When we would leave Beale Air Force Base to move an airplane over to England to do operations, we'd typically leave at 2 in the morning, and there was a reason for that. We would take off, we'd refuel over Utah, supersonically across Canada, over Goose Bay, Labrador. We would come down, we would refuel there, and then cross the Atlantic and go into Mildenhall Air Base. And typically the flight was about 4 hours and 20 minutes, something like that. And Mildenhall is right near Cambridge. Now, the aircraft at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. at Dulles Airport, it's the one that set the speed record from New York to London, an hour 55. Now, that's supersonically over New York, refueled over the Atlantic into England. 2 weeks later, it left London supersonically, refueled twice, 3 hours and 48 minutes. It crossed over Los Angeles. So you can kind of see when you were setting speed records, you were going a straighter path, that time period was pretty compressed. For the bicentennial, at one point, we were going to fly an SR-71 around the world, and it was going to come across Independence Square in Philadelphia at high noon on the 4th of July. And the mission was 17 hours and 20 minutes. But if people can recall, 1976, we were in the middle of a fuel embargo, and people were waiting in long lines to fill their cars up. And all of a sudden, the Air Force said, what's the first thing that the press is going to ask is, how much fuel did you burn? And they decided we can't answer that question because it would be too painful.
Wow, that's something. So that magic flight that took place between the U.S. and Britain, was that you flying it, or
no?
Do you know the guy who did it?
I know the guy that did it. That was in 1974. That was before my time. And that was the first time when the airplane actually landed in England. It went to the Farnborough Air Show, and it was the first time the aircraft had been displayed overseas.
There's only 85 of you. Now there's navigators. How many navigators were there?
About 85 or 86, right? The same number, because you went through training. And anytime you flew an operational mission, you had to fly it with your paired certified partner. If you were getting ready to fly an operational mission, you both had to pass a physical. If either one of you didn't pass the physical, a whole nother crew stepped in and took your flight. Now, when we were flying training missions in the United States, if one of the crew members became sick, we could then substitute another crew member in there because it didn't have the intensity that you had on an operational mission.
So there's dedicated crews.
Exactly.
So you had a dedicated navigator. Who was that?
A guy named John Murphy, absolutely magnificent individual. I feel like he's my brother. We went through training together. We flew together for 4 years. And then I had another navigator, Chuck Sober. We flew together for about a year. And then he moved to Omaha. So then I had my third navigator, Tim Shaw, and he was my last navigator. And then I left the program and went to the Pentagon.
At what point did you retire from the Air Force?
I retired in March of 1995 out of Beale Air Force Base, matter of fact, back home. Of my 28 years in the Air Force, I spent almost 10 of them at Beale Air Force Base. It was kind of neat because I grew up and we had family down in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and it was easy to go down and if I had time off and take the family down, particularly during the time period from 75 to 81 when our three daughters were growing up and they could spend time with their grandparents.
Now, you worked after you retired from the Air Force. When did you ultimately retire?
I ultimately retired in December of 2013. I started being a docent at the Air and Space Museum in 2003 when the museum opened, and I'm still giving tours there now.
How do you find that?
I find it most rewarding because people come from all over the world because the Smithsonian is looked upon as the premier air and space museum in the world from the collection that we have. And it gives me an opportunity because there's a new group of young people that are absolutely in love with the SR-71, and they look at it, and I think it's because of Star Wars or other things. They can't tell, is it a space plane? Is it an airplane? And they're absolutely fascinated by it. So I try to use that either at the museum or reaching out across the country using Zoom or Teams and talking to aviation classes to get them excited about, careers in STEM-related things, become teachers, become engineers, become scientists, become astronauts, become pilots. There's just, if Kelly Johnson were alive today, he would be absolutely in love on how inspirational his airplane is, even though it's in retirement. We built 32. We lost 12 because there was no modeling and simulation. My wife probably liked the SR better than any other airplane I flew because she knew how much I love flying the airplane. But most importantly, we sat on magnificent rocket ejection seats. So if the airplane got to a point where it was not controllable and there was nothing you could do, you reached down between your legs, you pulled the handle, and you lived to fly another day. We never had an Air Force fatality. The only fatality associated with the SR-71 was a test flight. They were trying something new. Bill Weaver was the pilot. There was a Lockheed test engineer in the back. The airplane had what we called an unstart over New Mexico. It completely came apart, and the backseater was killed. His ejection system worked, but I can't remember if he got hit by a piece of the airplane as it disintegrated or because of the shock of the airplane coming apart that he might have broken his neck. Anyway, that's the only fatality ever associated with the SR-71 Blackbird.
Tragic circumstances, but minimal. And 85 of you pilots, 85 navigators, you're really a special fraternal order in your own right. Do you find yourself getting together for reunions or anything along those lines?
Every 2 years, now we've had our last one, we would have a big gathering in Reno, Nevada. Now we're doing what we call symposias, and we pick museums that have Blackbirds, and we assemble 10, 15 SR-71 pilots, navigators, maintenance, intelligence people, and do panels and talk to people and talk about the airplane. We have a big one coming up in July of 2026 because we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of setting 3 world records that are still world records today for the bicentennial: 2,193 miles an hour, 85,000 feet, 69 sustained altitude, and 20,000, I can't remember the rest, 1,000-kilometer closed course record. It also marks 50 years. 1976 was when the British finally gave us permission to fly reconnaissance missions out of the United Kingdom into the Middle East and around the periphery of the Soviet Union. We never overflew Russia or Red China, but we flew right outside their international border, and with our radar sensors, we could look in almost 100 miles. Now, with our optical sensors, we could actually see people on the ground. We could identify men and women. The resolution was somewhere between 2 to 4 inches. We could identify cars. We could see, like in a parking lot, you could see the stripes. You could clearly identify different aircraft on the ground, ships, building. The radar was really useful because you could use it in day, night, particularly weather, and you can't recognize people. You can't see people. You could see a blob and you say that could be a car, could be an ambulance, could be something, but you could see the infrastructure. Like airplanes would show up. You could see buildings, you could see power lines, and there's parts of the world that the sun rarely shines. So if you need information from those areas, typically you needed a radar ground mapping device to be able to collect the vital information you needed. Why was the airplane retired? 3 reasons. The Cold War came to an end. They thought it was costing $85,000 an hour to operate. We're going to be a more peaceful world, so we can retire the SR-71. No, we kind of decided that wasn't a great idea. The second thing was that we never developed a data link. And so many of our systems now, our leaders want the information because the SR, everything was film and recorders. So you had to land, process the information, and then distribute it to those that had requested it. Like when I flew into the Middle East during a conflict over Yemen for President Carter, and he monitored a good part of the mission, he probably didn't see the pictures that we took, the whole border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for anywhere from 36 to 48 hours. The metric to our president today, because of data links, is 10 minutes. The SR-71 never had a data link developed so it could take off the information operationally in a timely fashion to get it to our leaders so they could take actions as something is evolving, not having to react after the fact when an event had already taken place.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking with retired United States Air Force Colonel Adelbert Buz Carpenter. Sir, I got to ask you this. Buzz Aldrin, it's B-U-Z-Z. Typically, a call sign is B-U-Z-Z. You had one Z shaved off. Is it because you flew so high and so fast? Why one Z versus two?
Well, why don't we keep that rumor? But actually, it was because one of my dad's test pilot friends, when I was 2 or 3 years old, I guess I went around the house making a buzzing sound. So the guy said, you ought to name that kid Buzz. And when they spelled my name, it was with a single Z, and it's always been a single Z. Buzz Aldrin and I have had discussions about the how you spell Buzz.
Very nice, very nice. And of course, Buzz Lightyear is the offshoot of Buzz Aldrin.
Exactly.
And he has 2 Z's as well. Thank you very much that you have a call sign that you can tell the story about. Sir, thank you so much. We really appreciate you, a golden treasure of American heritage, really, and especially aviation heritage. And here we say that our veterans are worth their value in gold. You certainly establish the absolute baseline for that, for all of future aviation to step upon. Thank you, sir, for your time.
You've been listening to Veterans Corner Radio with your host, retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Joe Muhlberger. The views expressed on this program are those of Joe and his guests and are opinions based on the best available information. In matters of law or governmental regulation, it will always be best to check with the appropriate agency. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us for the next program on Veterans Corner Radio.
Here's a quick final thought. If you're enjoying these podcasts, why not take a minute to subscribe or mark Veterans Corner Radio as a favorite? It's easy, and you'll be set to be among the first to find out when new podcasts are published. And thanks again for listening to Veterans Corner Radio.